But let's turn attention back to India, where the G20 summit has opened with the arrival of more leaders in the Asian nation. Let's tell you that President of the United States, Joe Biden, the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, and Nigerian's President, Bola Tinubu, are amongst the leaders attending. Let's now bring in a global affairs analyst, Kunle Falowo, to talk more on this. Good to have you join us. He joins us from the United States via Zoom.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we've seen a lot of G20 summits being held, and I just wanted to ask you, when you look at the outcome of those particular summits held before now, if there has been any significant outcome that we can pick out of it, and then the significance of India hosting this time.
Yes, so this is a big political statement from world leaders. Particularly the choice of India as the destination for where all the leaders are converging to hold the summit. It's very important, and it's a remarkable spate and change in the trajectory of world politics. If you look at India, you would see that it's a developing country with a lot of potential, and part of these things is making them visible to the world and understanding that these emerging developing countries are forced to reckon with. So having to have India as one of the destinations for that summit, it's really remarkable, to say the least. Now, to your other question, it's really a time when we need to take a look at some things that have been happening in the past, and if you take a step backwards and look at the G20 summits over time, like the ones that they had in the past, they had some resolutions that they came up with, and the resolutions are kind of binding, but for most countries, it's beneficial to a very few of them, which are the World 20 economy, the successful developed countries, that it's been very beneficial to them and their investment out of the shores of their countries. However, there is a change now because with the state of the world right now, world leaders will need to collaborate more and cooperate with emerging economies like Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, and other emerging economies that are showing so many potential. Let's not forget that Africa as its own has over 1.3 billion people in there. So it's a force to be reckoned with, and it's really better, and sooner than later, now that world leaders are realizing that, hey, we need to put the African Union and have Africa have
just before we get there, because some people will say, look, the G20 summit has been more of a time for posturing, much more than a time to make life impacting resolutions. I wanted to ask about how optimistic you are in terms of whether it's food security, the debt. I think it was debt restructuring for poorer nations, the climate change, all of these issues. That we're going to see resolution that impacts maybe globally at least.
Yes, absolutely. So if you let's look at the debt issue, for instance. You would see that a lot of African countries, when they go out and seek for foreign aids and loans, particularly in international banks and international financial a lot of interest rates are put on those loans that the African countries do get. Now, not forgetting also that China is a big investor in Africa, across Africa. The Middle Eastern countries are also putting their money in Africa too, and so on and so forth. But particularly, African leaders will now have to sit also in the negotiating table and let the financial institutions run by those successful countries know that gone are the days where you will put a stiff penalty or an exaggerated interest rate on the loans that we get from your financial institutions. Now we are forced to reckon with. So that is essential, and that is a powerful tool that African leaders are working with. And also, looking at food security, the Russian aggression in Ukraine has exacerbated the need for collaboration and cooperation with African countries. And also, when you also look at security and migration, they have to work together with those African countries, particularly also in this hot issue of climate change and global warming. The world leaders are looking at phasing out fossil fuel and gradually encourage and gradually also reducing global fuel emission, greenhouse emission particularly. So these are some of the things that it is instrumental for collaboration across board. Let me also remind our viewers that Congo has over 60% of renewable energy materials that are needed to do or to produce those life-changing life-changing materials that are needed to facilitate those those clean energy. And that's what we're looking at. Lithium, for instance, is a mass, and it's a massive in Congo, and it makes up for like half of the amount of the world. You can find that only in Congo. So
absolutely, and you already. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you already started touching on you've mentioned it earlier anyway. The fact that the G20 has now welcomed the African Union into the summit, just second only after the European Union. But you talked about Congo. You've mentioned some African countries with high reserves of minerals, and now that we have been welcomed into as permanent member of that summit, how significant is that, and what are the benefits?
The benefits are immense. Now African leaders can negotiate with a lot of the financial institutions in anywhere in the world, and they have a say in the negotiating table. Gone are the days where they'll come up with a plan and then they'll just hand it over to African countries. Now, African countries can actually sit down and negotiate on their terms, and that is essential because investment is essential for African countries to also grow. African countries cannot continue to be just a developing or underdeveloped country for forever. So we have to be in that powerhouse and continue to negotiate for our own people. And that's very essential because G20 is where you have all the leaders that come together and make life-changing decisions that affect every part of other countries. When you talk about investments and you talk about maybe climate change and other topical issues. Now, having a collaborative countries put together, because African Union has about 50 African countries underneath that entity. But some of the problem that could play out as the African Union as an entity representing in the G20 is the fact that there's inconsistencies sometimes in our policies, and sometimes also we have change of leadership. So it's not very consistent with some of the things that we're looking at the global space. But when we'll be able to get it together and talk in a common front and a common agenda, it will be beneficial to the entire continent.
And what will this mean for the AfCFTA?
Well, if you look back to the just concluded African summit in Kenya, it's remarkable because we're seeing some of those results in effect of talking in one accord. The Kenyan president was talking about having to put some of the funds that have been promised by world leaders, by the G20 countries, about 100 billion. It hasn't been fulfilled. That promise hasn't been fulfilled yet. Now that we're talking about it, and now that we have a stay in the table at the negotiating table, we could talk about that and we could get results. And now, aside from that, we're looking at also taxes from those G20 nations that are benefiting directly from some of the resources in Africa. So when we're getting more taxes coming from them and channeling those funds back to the African economy, now it now goes back to how we're able to implement those funds and resources that we get from those countries. That's a political issue. Individual African countries will have to deal with that. But nonetheless, it's a step in the right direction overall.
All right, thank you so much for that. We'll see how the summit plays out and the resolutions that will be reached. Thank you for talking to us, Global Affairs Analyst Kunle Falowo. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.